When you are new to Linux, it is easy to think of logs as a pile of messages you only look at when something breaks. Over time, you realize logs are one of the most valuable tools you have for understanding what a system is doing, whether it is healthy, and whether something suspicious has happened. The catch is that logs only help when they remain readable, searchable, and trustworthy, and that requires a pipeline, not just a file. A logging pipeline is the set of components that collect log messages, store them, forward them if needed, and keep them from growing without limit. In Linux, three names form a very common pipeline story: systemd, rsyslog, and logrotate. Each one has a different role, and the exam-level skill is being able to describe what each component contributes and why logs can become useless when one piece is missing. In this episode, we build a clear mental model of how logs are created and moved through the system, and how this pipeline keeps logs useful over time for troubleshooting and security. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first step is to understand what journaled does and why it exists. Systemd is a logging service that collects messages from many sources on the system, including the kernel, system services, and applications that write to standard logging interfaces. Its core job is aggregation, meaning it takes diverse log events and places them into a consistent journal store. One reason journaled matters is that it ties log messages to metadata, such as which service produced the message and when it occurred, making it easier to filter and correlate events. For beginners, the key idea is that journaled is the collector and organizer at the center of many modern Linux systems. It receives messages continuously and stores them in a way that supports structured searching rather than only plaintext scanning. That does not mean journaled replaces all other logs, and it means it becomes a primary source of truth for system and service events. If you imagine logs as water flowing through pipes, journaled is the main intake and reservoir where messages arrive and are recorded. Journaled also changes how you should think about where logs live, because it uses a journal store that can behave differently than traditional plaintext log files. In some configurations, the journal store is persistent, meaning it remains across reboots, while in others it is more volatile, meaning it may keep only recent data or reset after reboot. This matters because beginners sometimes reboot a system during troubleshooting and then wonder why the evidence disappeared. The pipeline idea helps here, because if journaled is the primary collector and its storage is not persistent, then rebooting can remove the very history you needed. At exam level, the main point is not to remember every storage mode, and it is to remember that journaled is a centralized collector whose retention behavior depends on configuration. If logs seem to vanish or be unexpectedly short-lived, journaled storage policy can be part of the explanation. Once you know that the journal is a managed store rather than a simple file, the behavior makes more sense. rsyslog fits into the story as a traditional and widely used syslog daemon that receives log messages and writes them to log files, and it can also forward logs to remote systems. In many environments, rsyslog is the piece that bridges modern journaled collection with long-standing syslog practices, because many tools and workflows still expect log files in standard locations. rsyslog can ingest messages from the system logging stream and apply rules about where to send them, such as writing certain categories to specific files or forwarding them to a central log server. The key beginner idea is that rsyslog is about distribution and persistence in familiar formats. It can take the broad stream of log events and organize them into different outputs based on facility, severity, or other criteria. That organization helps keep logs useful because it prevents a single massive file from becoming the only place everything is written. It also supports centralization, which is important in security contexts because logs are more valuable when you can correlate across many machines. For exam scenarios, rsyslog is often the component you associate with traditional syslog file writing and forwarding. The interaction between journaled and rsyslog is a common point of confusion because people assume only one logger should exist. In reality, journaled can collect messages and store them in the journal, while rsyslog can be used to write those messages into plaintext log files and forward them elsewhere. You can think of journaled as the centralized collector with rich metadata and rsyslog as the router and file writer that supports classic log workflows. In some systems, journaled acts as the main collector and rsyslog consumes from it, while in other systems rsyslog might be the primary collector and journaled plays a smaller role. You do not need to memorize distribution specifics, and you do need to understand that multiple components can cooperate in one pipeline. The exam-level takeaway is that journaled and rsyslog are not automatically duplicates, and they can be complementary, with journaled collecting and indexing and rsyslog writing and forwarding. When you understand that, you can explain why a message appears in one place and not another, because the pipeline might be configured to route only certain messages to certain outputs. This is the kind of reasoning that makes logging feel deliberate rather than arbitrary. Now we reach logrotate, which is one of the most practical tools for keeping logs useful over time because it prevents a system from being buried by its own history. Log files can grow without limit if you keep appending to them forever, and unlimited growth creates two serious problems. First, it can consume disk space, potentially filling the file system and causing unrelated failures across the system. Second, it can make analysis painful because searching an enormous file becomes slow and messy, and you lose the ability to focus on relevant recent events. Logrotate exists to manage the life cycle of log files by rotating them, meaning it renames or archives older logs and starts fresh new ones, often compressing old files and deleting very old ones based on policy. For beginners, the key idea is that logrotate is not a logger and it does not generate messages. It is a maintenance tool that keeps log storage sustainable and makes logs easier to handle. In exam language, logrotate is what keeps log files from growing forever and helps ensure the system does not run out of disk space due to logging. Log rotation also supports a forensic and troubleshooting balance, because you want enough history to diagnose problems, but not so much that storage becomes a risk. Rotation policies define how many old log files to keep, how long to keep them, and whether to compress them, and those choices reflect operational priorities. A system with high security requirements might keep longer history or forward logs to a central system for long-term retention, while keeping only a limited amount locally. A small system might keep fewer logs locally to preserve disk space, relying on the ability to reproduce issues or gather logs quickly when needed. The key point is that log usefulness depends on retention strategy, and logrotate is a big part of that strategy for file-based logs. Beginners sometimes assume that deleting logs is always bad because it removes evidence, but if you do not rotate and manage logs, you can lose evidence anyway when disk fills and services crash. Log management is therefore about preserving evidence intelligently, not about keeping everything forever in one place. On the exam, answers that recognize rotation as a way to balance retention and stability often align with expected thinking. It is also important to understand how the pipeline helps logs stay useful by preserving context, not just content. A log message without a timestamp is much less useful, and a log message without a source identifier is often ambiguous. Journaled's metadata helps preserve context by associating messages with services, process identifiers, and other details that make searching more precise. rsyslog's categorization helps preserve context by separating different kinds of messages into different streams, which reduces noise and makes patterns easier to spot. Logrotate preserves context by keeping historical segments of logs rather than letting everything blend into one giant file, and it can compress older segments while keeping them accessible. This is why the pipeline metaphor matters, because each tool contributes a different form of organization. A beginner who treats logging as one file misses the fact that usefulness comes from structure, separation, and retention policies. When you see logging questions, you should ask which part of the pipeline is failing: collection, routing, storage, or retention. That approach turns logging troubleshooting into a manageable reasoning problem. Security is also a major reason logs need a pipeline, because logs are not only for fixing broken systems, and they are for detecting and investigating suspicious activity. An attacker who gains access to a system might attempt to modify or erase logs to hide traces, which is why centralized forwarding and controlled permissions matter. If logs exist only locally and are not protected, they can be altered, weakening your ability to reconstruct events. A pipeline that forwards logs to a remote system reduces that risk because the attacker must compromise both the target system and the log receiver to fully hide activity. At exam level, you do not need to design a full security information and event management (SIEM) environment, but you should understand the principle that forwarding increases evidence durability. rsyslog commonly plays a role in forwarding, while journaled provides a centralized collection point from which forwarding can be configured. Logrotate helps with local retention, but in security contexts, long-term retention is often achieved through forwarding rather than keeping everything locally forever. Recognizing the difference between local rotation and central retention is an important maturity step. Another practical issue that can make logs useless is inconsistency in formatting and time, which is why logging is often discussed alongside time synchronization. If system clocks are wrong, timestamps and logs become misleading, and correlating events across systems becomes difficult. Journaled and rsyslog can both record timestamps, but they cannot correct time. This is why a healthy logging pipeline often depends on NTP or other time alignment mechanisms, because time is the backbone of log correlation. Beginners sometimes chase log mysteries where events appear out of order when the root cause is time drift. If you remember that time consistency is part of log usefulness, you can interpret those scenarios more accurately. Another formatting issue is that some applications log to files directly while others log to system streams, which can create gaps unless your pipeline accounts for both. The exam-level takeaway is that logs stay useful when the system has consistent time, consistent collection, and consistent retention policy. When any of those are missing, logs can become misleading or incomplete. It is also worth acknowledging that logging has a cost, and pipeline design is partly about managing that cost. Excessively verbose logging can consume disk, overwhelm search tools, and hide important signals under noise. Insufficient logging can leave you blind when something goes wrong. Journaled can help by providing filtering and structured storage, while rsyslog can help by routing different severities and categories to appropriate destinations. Logrotate helps by preventing storage blowups even when volume is high, but it does not solve the analysis problem if the content is too noisy. The right mindset is that logging is a security and reliability control that must be tuned to be useful, not merely enabled. For beginners, that tuning concept can be as simple as recognizing that you should log what matters and manage retention so the logs remain accessible. On the exam, if you see a scenario about disk filling due to logs or logs being too large to manage, logrotate and retention policy are often part of the conceptual answer. If you see a scenario about needing centralized visibility, rsyslog-style forwarding is often part of the conceptual answer. To conclude, the Linux logging pipeline is best understood as a coordinated set of components that collect, store, route, and maintain log data, so it remains useful over time. Systemd journaled is the central collector and organizer for many modern Linux systems, capturing messages from services and the kernel and storing them with helpful metadata. rsyslog provides traditional syslog capabilities, writing logs to files in familiar locations and forwarding selected logs to remote systems for central retention and security. Logrotate manages the lifecycle of file-based logs, rotating, compressing, and pruning them to prevent disk exhaustion and preserve manageable history. Logs stay useful when this pipeline preserves context, maintains retention, supports searchability, and is backed by consistent timekeeping and sensible volume control. When you can describe what each component contributes and why failures in any one part can make logs disappear, explode in size, or become untrustworthy, you have the exam-ready foundation for understanding Linux logging as a system rather than a pile of messages.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.